Hey everyone, and welcome back. This is one of a series of videos looking at key issues and concepts in American politics. In this video, we're going to explore the evolution of American federalism over time. You should remember from our previous video that federalism is one of three ways to divide power between the national and subnational governments in a country, with the other two being confederation and unitary systems. In a confederation, like the system of national government that existed under the Articles of Confederation, authority rests primarily with the subnational governments, and the national government has only those powers granted to it by the states. In a unitary system, like the United Kingdom, the opposite is true. Authority rests primarily with the national government, and the subnational governments have only those powers granted to them by the national government. But in a federal system, authority is divided between the two levels, with both the national and subnational governments having specifically defined powers which generally cannot be abridged by the other. But the specific divisions of power between the national and state governments in a federal system can and do evolve over time. In some historical periods, such as shortly after the founding, the bulk of political authority and power may rest with the states. In other periods, such as in our current political era, the federal government may exercise more power. And anything between is possible. So in this video, we're going to look at how the distribution of power and authority in our federal system has changed over time. What factors account for the evolution of our political system over time? That's what we'll consider now. But let's start at the beginning, with the system of federalism as it existed in 1787 when the Constitution was adopted. Now, we've talked about this in other videos, so I'll be brief here, but when the Constitution was adopted, it was adopted in response to the failure of the confederal system under the Articles of Confederation. Remember that one of the primary challenges the founders were dealing with were the problems presented by a national government that was viewed as being too weak. They were anxious to expand the powers of the national government, but they were also hesitant to go too far, as they equally feared what they viewed as the tyranny created by the centralization of power in the unitary system of Great Britain. And the anti-federalists were pushing hard to retain as much power to the states as possible. And so the compromise position that emerged was a federal system in which the majority of power was retained by the states. The powers granted to the federal government were generally viewed as those as enumerated in the Constitution, maintaining an army and providing for the national defense, borrowing and coining money, establishing post offices, protecting copyrights and patents, and so on. The vast majority of governmental power was still viewed as resting with the states, as acknowledged by the Reserve Power Clause of the 10th Amendment. But early in the history of the United States, that distribution of power slowly began to change, as the federal government slowly gained more power. And much of the struggle to define the precise relationship between the national and state governments was defined by two central questions. The first was the question of the economy. Remember that the Constitution gave Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. This is usually referred to as the Commerce Clause. It also gave Congress the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, which is often referred to as the necessary and proper or the elastic clause. These two clauses were balanced against the reserved power clause of the 10th Amendment, which, if you remember, says that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. And the degree to which these are balanced against one another, came to be the primary mechanism through which American federalism has evolved over time. More specifically, we see the Marshall Court playing a central role in defining the nature of American federalism early in the country's history. Through a series of landmark decisions, the Marshall Court, named for Chief Justice John Marshall, expanded both the power of the federal judiciary and the power of the federal government more broadly. There are two cases which are particularly important in this respect. The first is the case of McCulloch versus Maryland. At issue in this case was whether or not the federal government had the authority to create a national bank. The state of Maryland had imposed a tax on the bank's operation, and the bank's cashier, James McCulloch, refused to pay it. In McCulloch versus Maryland, the court ruled that the federal government, under the Necessary and Proper Clause, did indeed have the power to create a national bank. More broadly, the decision established the principle of implied powers, which allowed the federal government to take actions not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution as long as they were related to its enumerated powers. This interpretation of the Constitution thus expanded the powers of the federal government relative to the states. The second case was that of Gibbons v. Ogden. This case resolved around a dispute between two steamboat operators in New York, with one holding a state-granted monopoly and the other holding a federal license. The court ruled that Congress had the exclusive power to regulate interstate commerce under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, thereby reinforcing the federal government's authority over economic matters that crossed state lines and further strengthening its power relative to the states. But even as the courts were gradually expanding the power of the federal government, the states were pushing back, asserting their own powers as well. This pushback against federal expansion was seen most clearly in the Nullification crisis of 1832. The Nullification crisis was sparked by the Tariff Act of 1828, which imposed high taxes on imported goods in order to shield American industries from competition from foreign goods. This act was viewed, particularly in the southern states, as disproportionately benefiting commercial and industrial interests in the North and harming the agrarian economies of the South. John C. Calhoun, who at the time was serving as Andrew Jackson's vice president, decried the tariffs. According to him, the tariffs violated the right of the states under the Constitution. Calhoun resigned his position as vice president and was elected to the U.S. Senate, where he continued to assert the doctrine of states' rights and promoted the doctrine of nullification. In his response to the tariffs, and at Calhoun's urging, South Carolina passed the Nullification Ordinance, which declared the tariffs of 1828 and subsequent tariffs null and void within the state's borders. The act of nullification was a direct challenge to the authority of the federal government and raised questions about the balance of power between the states and the federal government. President Andrew Jackson, a strong advocate of federal power, responded to South Carolina's action by threatening to use military force to enforce federal law. The situation was diffused when Congress passed a compromise tariff that satisfied South Carolina's concerns and avoided the need for military action. However, the crisis had far-reaching implications for the understanding of federalism in the United States. The nullification crisis highlighted the tensions between states' rights and federal power in the U.S. It raised important questions about the extent to which states could challenge federal law and the role of the federal government in enforcing that law. And it underscored the importance of compromise and negotiation in resolving conflicts between the states and the federal government. Furthermore, the crisis had a lasting impact on American politics, particularly in the South. It helped to solidify the idea of nullification as a legitimate tool for resisting federal authority and contributed to the growing rift between northern and southern states that ultimately led to the Civil War. The third area where federalism struggled was on the question of slavery in the United States. Indeed, throughout the first half of the 19th century, the question of slavery fueled increasingly bitter disputes between northern and southern states. Federalism played a central role in these debates as states' rights advocates in the South sought to protect the institution of slavery from federal interference. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850 were both attempts to strike a balance between the interests of slave and free states. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was a legislative agreement that aimed to resolve the contentious issue of slavery in the United States. At the time, there were 11 free states and 11 slaveholding states, and the admission of Missouri as a slaveholding state threatened to upset the delicate balance of power in Congress. The compromise allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state, but prohibited slavery in any new states north of the 36-degree 30-minute parallel, except for Missouri. The Compromise of 1850 attempted to maintain a similar balance. It was a package of 5 bills passed by the U.S. Congress that aimed to resolve the controversy over slavery in the territories acquired during the Mexican-American War. The compromise allowed California to enter the Union as a free state, abolished the slave trade but not slavery itself in Washington, D.C., and established the territories of New Mexico and Utah without any specific mention of slavery. The compromise also included the Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens to capture and return escaped slaves. The act was widely opposed by abolitionists in the North. All 3 of these compromises were essentially efforts to maintain the balance of power between free and slave states by limiting the power of the federal government and maintaining the system of slavery. But precisely because they failed to reconcile the central question of slavery and define the scope of states' rights, they contributed to growing animosity between the regions leading up to the Civil War. The U.S. Civil War was a turning point in American history and had a profound impact on the federal system. The conflict stemmed from deep-rooted disagreements over the balance of power between the federal government and the states, primarily concerning the issue of slavery. The war ultimately resulted in the defeat of the Confederacy and the abolition of slavery, marking a decisive victory for proponents of stronger central government. In the aftermath of the war, the federal government emerged with considerably more authority and power than it had held previously, setting the stage for a new era of American federalism. Indeed, in the aftermath of the Civil War, we see this expanded federal power operationalized in several ways, perhaps most significantly through the ratification of the 14th Amendment and the incorporation of the Bill of Rights to the states. The 14th Amendment was adopted in 1868 as one of 3 Reconstruction-era amendments. The amendment was designed primarily to protect the rights of newly freed slaves, but it had far-reaching implications for the balance of power between the federal government and the states. This is because the 14th Amendment contains several key provisions, including the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause, which have been used by the courts to apply the protections of the Bill of Rights to state governments. More specifically, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment is very similar to the Due Process Clause of the 5th Amendment, except that it protects individual rights against violations by the states rather than only by the federal government. The 5th Amendment provides in part that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Similarly, the 14th Amendment provides that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. Remember that prior to the adoption of the 14th Amendment and the incorporation of the Bill of Rights, the protections afforded by the Bill of Rights applied only to the federal government. While many states had similar provisions in their own constitution, the federal constitution did nothing to protect individual rights against violations by the states. In other words, while the Constitution prevented the federal government from violating rights like freedom of speech, religion, and the press, and protected the rights of criminal defendants, state governments could still take actions that violated those rights. The 14th Amendment changed that. Through the process of incorporation, the reach of the federal government was gradually expanded and limited the power of states to infringe upon individual rights. We examine this process in greater detail in another video, but a specific example of the process of incorporation can be seen in the case of Gitlow v. New York, where in 1925, the Supreme Court ruled that the First Amendment's protection of free speech applied to state governments through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. This process of incorporation has significantly expanded the scope of federal power, as it has allowed the federal government to enforce the Bill of Rights against the states and further protected the civil liberties of American citizens. Reconstruction officially ended in 1877 with the withdrawal of federal troops from the southern states and the return of local control. This marked the beginning of a period in which states' rights once again gained prominence, particularly in the South. The end of Reconstruction saw the rise of Jim Crow laws, which were designed to enforce racial segregation and limit the political power and civil rights of African Americans. During this time, the federal government took a step back from its active role in protecting civil rights, allowing the states to reassert their authority in these areas. This retrenchment of states' rights in this area persisted until the mid-20th century, when the civil rights movement and subsequent federal legislation once again shifted the balance of power towards the federal government in matters concerning civil rights and individual liberties, topics we return to later in the course. But even as the federal government was retreating in its enforcement of civil rights, the power of the federal government was expanded in the economic arena. Indeed, the Progressive Era, roughly 1890 to 1920, was marked by a growing recognition of the need for government intervention to address social and economic problems. Many Americans began to advocate for a more active role for the federal government in regulating businesses and protecting workers, consumers, and the environment. As a result, the federal government's power and influence expanded during this period, with the establishment of agencies such as the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887, created in order to regulate railroads and later trucking and other modes of commerce after 1906. The Food and Drug Administration, created in 1906, protects consumers from adulterated medicines and ensures the safety of the food supply. The Federal Trade Commission, established in 1914, enforces antitrust laws and ensures fair competition in the U.S. economy. These new regulatory bodies marked a significant shift in federalism as the federal government took on a more proactive role in addressing societal issues that transcended state boundaries. The Great Depression of the 1930s prompted a further expansion of federal power. Remember that the Great Depression was a massive economic crisis, the likes of which had not been seen in the modern United States. Unemployment skyrocketed and the stock market collapsed. And there was no social safety net, no unemployment insurance, no food stamps, welfare, or other programs we're familiar with today. If you lost your job, as more than a third of all Americans did during this period, you had to rely on private charity or you went hungry. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sought to address the economic crisis through a series of ambitious programs collectively known as the New Deal. The New Deal sought to provide economic relief to those suffering from the Great Depression, stimulate economic recovery, and introduced long-term reforms to prevent future economic crises. New Deal programs included public work programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration, intended to provide direct employment to unemployed Americans. It also included a variety of social safety nets and expanded federal regulation over the economy. It introduced the first school lunch programs and created the food stamp program. It created the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration to promote home ownership and established a wide variety of worker protections, including minimum wages, restrictions on the use of child labor, and the creation of the 8-hour workday. And it established the Social Security program to protect retired Americans from poverty. These initiatives marked a significant shift in federalism as they demonstrated the growing willingness of the federal government to take responsibility for addressing social and economic problems that affected the nation as a whole. They also dramatically expanded federal power based on an expansive interpretation of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. The Commerce Clause granted Congress the authority to regulate commerce among the several states, but prior to the New Deal, it had not really been used as the basis for wide-ranging expansions of federal power into nearly every aspect of American life. But under the New Deal, it became the basis for dramatically expanded federal programs. In cases such as the National Labor Relations Board versus Jones Steel Corporation and Wickard versus Filburn, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld broad interpretations of the Commerce Clause that allowed the federal government to regulate a wide range of economic activities, even those that seemed primarily local in nature. This marked a significant departure from previous understandings of federalism, as it further empowered the federal government to intervene in the nation's economic affairs. Beginning in the 1950s, the U.S. enters a new era of American federalism. The Civil Rights Movement, which encompassed demands for equal political and civil rights, including an end to the Jim Crow laws, led to a further expansion of federal power as the federal government intervened to address racial discrimination and segregation, particularly in the southern states. This intervention marked a departure from the earlier retrenchment of states' rights that followed the end of Reconstruction. The most notable example of this trend was the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was a watershed moment in the history of American federalism. The act prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in various areas, including employment and public accommodations. It also granted the federal government new powers to enforce desegregation in public schools and other facilities. By empowering the federal government to enforce civil protections, the Civil Rights Act marked a shift in the balance of power between the states and the federal government. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 similarly expanded federal power. The act sought to redress racial discrimination in voting practices. It gave the federal government the authority to oversee voter registration and election procedures in states and localities with a history of discriminatory voting practices. The power of the federal government peaked in the early 1970s, sparking a movement pushing back against it. This movement, often referred to as New Federalism, sought to restore some degree of power and autonomy to the states in response to concerns that the federal government had become too powerful and intrusive. The push for New Federalism was perhaps first operationalized by President Richard Nixon's revenue sharing program. Enacted in 1972, revenue sharing provided federal funds to state and local governments with few restrictions on how such funds could be spent. This approach was intended to give states more flexibility and discretion in addressing local needs while ensuring they had the resources necessary to do so. The New Federalism movement gained further momentum under President Ronald Reagan, who championed the idea of devolving power back to the states. Reagan sought to reduce the size and scope of the federal government, both by cutting federal programs and by granting states greater autonomy to administer programs such as welfare and education. This approach was intended to promote efficiency, reduce bureaucracy, and give states more control over their own affairs. And more recently still, the U.S. Supreme Court has issued several decisions which have curtailed federal power, most notably in its decision in Shelby County v. Holder in 2013, which ruled that key provisions of the Voting Rights Act were unconstitutional, and in U.S. v. Lopez 1995 and U.S. v. Morrison in 2000, which both ruled that Congress's use of the Commerce Clause to prohibit firearms possessions in school zones and to permit victims of gender-motivated violence to sue in federal courts were unconstitutional expansions of the Commerce Clause. So, in summary, we can see American federalism shifting gradually back and forth between greater power to the states and greater power to the federal government. At the founding, the majority of power rested with the states, and the federal government was relatively weak. Through the early decisions of the Marshall Court, the power of the federal government gradually expanded. The relative balance between federal and state powers led many to call this the era of dual federalism. Under dual federalism, the national government was supreme in some areas, while the states were supreme in others, with layers of authority separated from one another. The Nullification crisis and the Civil War expanded state power and reduced federal power under the doctrine of states' rights. This trend was briefly reversed during the era of Reconstruction, but resumed in even greater force during the Progressive Era and the New Deal. Because many of the New Deal programs involved close relationships between the federal and state governments, this period was sometimes referred to as the era of cooperative federalism. Under cooperative federalism, the national and state governments were viewed as partners, working together to solve major problems. Federal power reached its zenith during the Civil Rights Era. During this period, the federal government's expansive use of its own power, particularly its use of its control over tax revenues and grant funding to promote states or discourage states from particular behavior, led some critics to label it the era of coercive federalism. But a new era in the 1970s began to expand federal power and autonomy to the states under the label of New Federalism. That's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching. Bye.